Hey everyone, today I was going to seek to rebuttal one of Alex O'Connor's recent debates against a Christian on the goodness of God and suffering in this world. I'm about to present the short clip of his debate, followed by my rebuttals. I hope you enjoy.
God exists and wants to love everybody, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable.
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become better than I am. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
I don't want to talk about your son because it's tragic to think about, but somebody else's son
Sure.
has suffered and died immediately as a
Sure.
result of that suffering. They don't get to develop in the same way.
I would agree that on a micro level, it's very hard to justify. And we can ask the question, why doesn't God intervene on all
So
of
look,
these
you might be able to
sufferings?
justify an amount of suffering. There are some instances where maybe a certain amount of suffering brings about a certain amount of good in a situation. But when a child dies of leukemia and they're dead,
Could there be a purpose to it? What if the death of the child brings their parents to God?
then
to
perhaps
salvation?
then the parents should be grateful that their child got leukemia because it's doing the will
No,
of the Lord.
not necessarily.
That seems
All
right,
obscene
pause.
to me.
No.
Debating the Christian God requires engaging in the internal narrative structure of Scripture. The nature of God, suffering, and moral order in Christianity are not abstract propositions, but components of a teleological story involving creation, the fall, redemption, and restoration. Logic and epistemology and science play important roles within this framework, but are not necessarily foundational to it. Once the biblical narrative is removed or replaced with external moral intuitions, the critique no longer addresses the Christian God, and the internal coherence of the argument collapses. And this is true with any narrative system. Remove its axioms, and the internal logic ceases to function. And unfortunately, this is a mistake that O'Connor has made here, as well as many atheists. What they do is they're trying to debate against the Christian God, but they remove themselves from the narrative, and they remove God from the narrative. Once you do that, the God that you're continuing with is a conceptualization of God, whether individual or collectively. It's an abstract conceptualized form of God. It's not necessarily the biblical God in and of itself. You have to keep it within the contextual elements of the narrative to be able to make sense of what's being stated there. Now, I'm not necessarily here to defend Christianity. For me, if Christianity is true, it can defend itself just like any type of empirical type truth. So for me, I'm not here to defend it, but I am here to help correct the mistakes that are so commonly made, just like what had happened here. Not being able to make sense, to find coherence in the narrative elements, contextual elements that are at play within that narrative. And so, and this takes a lot of studies in theology, even Christian apologetics, histories, and even logic and philosophy to a certain degree, to understand exactly what's going on, as well as the original language components. So I kind of have broken this down into three different parts. First, focus on the goodness of God, the love of God. Then we'll look at the nature of suffering, and then we'll look at the nature of reality, all embedded within the narrative of Scripture, of what's going on within the biblical narrative, not necessarily grafting in too much of other elements, although they do help in understanding the story at play. But so understanding the goodness of God. And this is where a lot of people get mixed up. If God is so good, then why does he allow suffering? What is goodness to begin with? And this is something that I have thought on tremendously throughout the years to understand what is at play, to try to make sense of this. Because people throw this word around so much between goodness and love. And I love how people use these words, and it's mostly interchangeable with that of nice or kind. So instead of perceiving the Christian God within the narrative of being the father figure, they perceive him as some type of should be like a Santa Claus grandfather type figure. And it's like that's not accurate, not in relationship with the narrative itself. So even Christ, they're like, oh, he's so nice. It's like, yeah, he's nice, but he's also a warrior that comes back to slay the evil. So it's like, how nice is he exactly? You're getting it confused. You're confusing love and goodness with kindness. That's an element. That is a facet of love and goodness. That is not the totality, the sum total of those concepts. Goodness, at least in the Christian sense, one of the words being used for good in the New Testament is the Greek word agathos, which means good. It means one of the components of it that I love the most is that of to benefit, that which is useful. It is dichotic. The same thing with love, because they're one and the same idea, concept. And it's this idea that you can be disciplinary and you can be gracious at the same time. And we see this even with parents, especially good parents. Good parents are those that can find a balance between the two. So in psychology, we know that you have authoritarian parents, and then you have passive parenting, and then you have authoritative parenting. And the literature, time and time again, supports that the authoritative approach is the most conducive towards proper development for any type of situation for children. And that is a blend between the two. So in authoritarian, the first one listed there, focuses more on strict discipline and judgment, and no real room for grace or encouragement. While the passive side is more strictly on the grace and encouragement facet of goodness and love within parenting, but no actual discipline, no structure going on. Authoritative parenting is where you encourage and you provide liberty, but within a certain parameter. So you set structures and boundaries, and then you expand those boundaries along with their development. So you're scaffolding their development as it goes along. And so you're helping them develop properly and to develop discipline in and of themselves, so they're not just chaotic chimpanzees slinging crap around in society, but they're actually, develop into productive entities that can become successful for themselves, but also for society and contribute something to society. And that appears to be the most conducive means of parenting. And the same is true with the Christian God. You look at God, he's disciplinary, but he's also gracious and encouraging. And we see this, exemplified the best through the character of Christ, of course. And so Christ is gracious, but he's also telling people to go sin no more and to, take up the cross, deny themselves, sacrifice the pleasures of this world, those disciplinary, structured components at play, while at the same time finding grace that, hey, you're going to make mistakes, but you get back up, you do it again, and you keep moving, and you have that freedom. And as long as you keep trying to adhere to the structure, and then those boundaries will expand as you develop, as your individual self and psyche develop in accordance to the structure itself will expand. And you see this too with in real life constantly. People that develop themselves, opportunities come their way, and those boundaries that once constrained them begin to loosen up and expand outward. and they make new connections, new things happen, and all of a sudden they're able to develop themselves even further through those greater connections and greater access and more resources and things of that nature, expand in conjunction with their development. So it's almost as though it's even apart from the spiritual component, religious component of Christianity. It appears as though that idea, that concept, is actually embedded within the fabric of being itself. As you go on, and that's the Pareto distribution, the Matthew principle, where more is given to those who have, and those who have not, more, that is what they do have is taken away. It's like the more you develop yourself and the more you seek to expand those boundaries and to adhere to the structure at least and play the part, and utilize your resources, utilize your talents, your gifts and abilities, then the more opportunities come and the more you can expand yourself and expand your territory, so to speak, your conceptualized territory, as well as your physical and psychological territory. And so it's so there's this a dichotomy to goodness and love in and of itself. Again, Christ is gentle as a lamb, but he's also a divine warrior that slays everyone at the end. And so we have to bear that in mind, that goodness is not just kindness, and that Jesus is here to save everybody. And that's what's remarkable about that as well, is that although he wants everyone to be saved, he explicitly states that only a few will actually be chosen at the end of the day. Many are called, but few are chosen. And that's where the free will component comes into play. But again, it's not just strictly grace. It's also the disciplinary structured element that's at play as well. So we have to get away from this conceptualization that goodness equates to soul kindness, and that you can translate that from goodness to kindness. That's not exactly accurate at all. It's more accurate to say that goodness is composed of multiple different characteristics that are at play, and one of them including being that of kindness. But there's also discipline and structure and judgment and all sorts of different things that go along with that. And so it's more complex, to say the least. And so to understand that, it helps kind of enlighten, okay, well, God is good, not necessarily just kind. He's good. And so he seeks to benefit all those that are at play, all of his children, quote unquote. And so that's the way you look at it within the narrative, anyhow. And so if that's true, well, then you still have to answer the question of, well, why is there suffering? Why do we have suffering in the first place? This makes absolutely no sense. According to the text, obviously the fall occurred, and that provided suffering to enter in. Now, of course, if I were to dissect that more from a psychological evolutionary perspective, which that's, my tendencies to do so, is that I would say what the text is actually implying is that the emergence, I would say the full articulation of consciousness itself, that we became aware of suffering, when prior to that, the lower animals themselves do not appear to be fully articulate in that manner. And there's debates that can be done with that as well. But so getting back to the narrative, the fall of Adam and Eve, and then it allowed, the full-fledged suffering to occur. And so we're kind of stuck with sickness and death and all the negative attributes of reality now. And we have to contend with that. And if God's good, then why does he allow us to suffer? Why didn't he just take all the suffering away? Even without the fall, looking at the narrative itself, suffering appears to be, at least to a certain degree, okay, before we get off into the excruciating type suffering that goes on, let's look at just everyday suffering in and of itself. So going back to the dichotomy of love, that the disciplinary structured side of it is that in order to grow and develop and evolve, suffering is necessary. It's an essential component of development. Whenever you study something difficult, you suffer during the process. To say otherwise means that you're actually not studying anything remotely challenging to you whatsoever. Because I know whenever I engage in something that's extraordinarily difficult to understand, it's excruciating to a certain extent, because you're trying to understand the words and the concepts that are articulated, and you're trying to make sense of it, and you're trying to integrate that data into your current framework. And then at the same time, if you're real good at it, you can critically think on that data and not just integrate it into your current framework, but transform that framework in and of itself through accommodation. So that's suffering in and of itself. It's a excruciating process to go through. That's why most people don't do it. But that's what actually is what develops you and helps you evolve and to expand your perception and to broaden, to expand your perception and understanding of reality and others and yourself. And nothing but good, beneficial things come from that. And then there's times for rest and recovery. So that's the grace component at play, where you actually take time to recover and allow that information to truly integrate and synthesize within your psyche. So, and so suffering is a necessary part of being. And that's what actually helped us evolve as a species. So extracting outside in the narrative real quick, although I think evolution, as far as I can tell, are part of the 6 days, and you can look at my older videos on that idea, promoted first by Gerald Schroeder, but is that the cognition that we possess today is a consequence of various different sufferings throughout our primitive past, through the span of 5-6 million years. This is through climate change. This is through survival mechanisms, tool making, constructions, dialogue to a certain degree. However, that went on, most likely implicit to begin with, and then became explicit as we possessed language over the course of time. And those are all means of suffering that helped us form coherence that we call consciousness, to be able to properly engage with the world. And that became more and more precise over the course of time, to where we were actually able to create artistic works and to write things down and then formulate ideas and critically think and all these different things to what we have today. So we are the beneficiaries of that suffering process. Again, this even goes down to the individual level, that to develop, you must suffer. Now, in regards to what O'Connor and many atheists bring up, is the idea, well, what about those that never even get to develop, as he said in this video? What about those that don't get to develop? They never even got a chance to develop. She died of leukemia, which, by the way, my daughter actually went through leukemia treatment several years ago. So we're, quite familiar with that. And we actually knew people that had leukemia, their children did die. And so in order to, how does that make any sense? Why would a good God allow that? Well, then you have to go ahead and move on to the next part, which is the nature of reality that is articulated within the narrative. So the nature of reality is contextual, and it appears to articulate the idea of concept of block time within physics, and that is that everything occurs at one time. And so right now things are occurring, let's say hypothetically, with that of Moses and ascending Mount Sinai, or Noah and the flood, or Christ, in the transfiguration, things of that nature, are all occurring at one time. We just perceive them as unfolding through biological mechanisms of decay and whatnot. And so that unfolds time. And this is actually somewhat accurate within physics. That is kind of the primary proposition, that we live in an enclosed universe, and therein exists block time. And now, there in the Christian context, in the narrative, is that there's an underlying fundamental reality that transcends this reality, and that is the heavenly realm, where eternity exists, and that is what gives structure to this reality, and that this reality is but a mere simulation. We could use that term. That everything that is seen is made things that are unseen, and that this is just the higher dimensional realm is the true reality, and this is but a mere simulation. And in the text, it talks about how we die, and then we awaken into this new reality, and all former things are forgotten. So we no longer remember this. It's but like waking up from a bad dream. So those that would have cancer that died, they're saved, they're up in heaven. They never even remember that experience to begin with. They wake up as though it was from a bad dream, and then they move on in the true presence of God. According to the narrative, this is the whole thing. Now, if you wanted to make the other sides that, well, how true is that? Where is the parent? Okay, whatever, we can do that. That's just fine. We can do that later. And like I said, I'm not here to necessarily defend the faith, because I think the faith, if it's true, and then it can defend itself to a certain degree. But we can debate this, and I'm trying to understand it myself continuously. I'm never at an ends, and I think that's the right way of doing it. So you're never truly possessed by something, so to speak, but you're never completely absent from the idea, especially there's a lot of evidence that support the claim. So for me, with Christianity, that's the way I perceive it, is that, I do believe to a certain extent, and I seek to develop my relationship with God through a lot of my studies. That's what I do, to try to know Him and to establish that relationship, so to speak, if it is true, and kind of go through there. So you're wrestling with God, and you're working out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And I have great respect towards God and in the Bible and things, and I'm trying to make the most sense out of it and the best that I can. I think that's a good approach. But anyway, so you have that narrative promoting this idea, and so if you're going to argue against the Christian God, again, as I said at the beginning, that you have to remain within the confines of the contextual elements of the narrative itself. So this is what it states. And then what's interesting, again, going back to the nature of suffering, something I didn't forget is the idea that suffering even appears so essential to being that it also appears in the heavenly realm itself. Choice is even there. The freedom to sin is even there. And people automatically, within the Christian context, attack me for this idea. But it's like, pause for a moment. If that weren't true, then how did Lucifer fall from heaven? It's like, you got to really think on this real quick. It's like, how did he even fall to begin with? If sin isn't allowed in heaven and we're all perfect, which no one's perfect but Christ, according to the text, according to the narrative itself, and then we're never perfected. We're a little bit more perfected, but we're not absolutely perfected like Christ. We're constantly developing, and development and suffering provide meaning. It provides a structure of meaning, a constraint that allows us to develop greater coherence and to expand our boundaries. So in the new heaven and earth, it even discusses the same idea, that it says that there'll be no more crying, there'll be no more sickness, these type of things. But if you actually look at the Greek word being used, it does not use the Greek words describing simple sufferings, but rather excruciating suffering. So there's no longer going to be the cancers and things that eat away our bodies and things of that nature. But that does not mean that we're not going to experience some type of pain. We'll still have sensory modalities that give coherence, that give interaction, that allow consciousness to emerge in the first place. And this is an idea that I've been working on as well with the hierarchy of consciousness. And it's going to be in a work I'm working on now. You can go on my blog and read some of my outline of what that is. But anyways, so there appears to be the ability to sin in heaven, and there also appears to be at least a more subtle aspect of suffering that occurs. And we're also, the claim is that in heaven we will be serving the Lord. That's another idea that it articulates, is that we will be doing things for the Lord. We have to have a sense of purpose. Otherwise, you're just an automaton. And I've had so many Christians, friends and stuff, seek to debate me, to no avail, of course, with this idea. It's like, well, I know we're supposed to be perfect and angelic beings. It's like, well, even the angelic beings fell from heaven. They sinned. And there appears to be somewhat of sensory modality. So we're experiencing things, and you experience things. Experience things means that suffering is a asymmetry that arises, I would say, out of the symmetrical perceptions and perceptions and sensations that we experience. Pain can be as subtle as just barely walking on the ground. You can feel pain, especially as you get older. Certain injuries or something of that sort. Hard floor that you walk on is suffering, is pain. We have those pain receptors, and so that in order to have the coherent structure of consciousness, I've argued this too with the ideas of AI. The AI will never be conscious until it has sensory modalities to allow it to truly experience reality. Then coherence, then it becomes more of a coherent structure. But there's even more to it than that. It's very complicated. And that's why it took 6 million years of human evolution just to create coherence. But, you actually look at the evolutionary history. I mean, golly, 3 billion years of evolutionary history to be able to, emerging from the first DNA to now, to be able to produce true consciousness where we interact, remember, plan, and do different things, understand both the past and the future, and to make sense of all of it. And so it's very complicated. But anyways, so the nature of reality itself is that this is but a simulated reality. Whenever we die, whether it's when we're 2 or 6 or 10 or any of the things, that doesn't negate the effects felt by those that are that we love. Even Jesus wept, at the funeral, and so that's something we have to bear in mind, is that to experience those emotions are justified, and then you move on with life, and then you try to make sense of it from there and develop coherence, greater coherence than you had before. And then the person that actually did pass is now in the presence of God, developing greater coherence, however that works itself out, serving in some way and doing something. And certainly, of course, I'm not even actually know what I was going to get into the idea of, well, we're going to be serving God. That just seems wrong. That's, some people have stated that. It's like, well, no, you serve God through just existence itself and engagement and activities and what you're good at. And, that is serving God, so to speak. So what that means, we don't know. So obviously the text doesn't elaborate too much on that. But, and then the next factor is that within that block time structure, we don't know exactly how the death of that individual affects this reality. So even beyond the transcendent reality, we're not exactly sure how it's affecting those. And that guy in the video kind of goes on to explain that, well, it may affect this person, brings them to Christ and things. And then O'Connor's like, oh, well, that's just terrible. It's like, well, no, not necessarily. If you're looking at it from the narrative, you just extracted yourself outside the narrative. So the logical coherence of the argument collapsed at that very moment. It's like the person is in the presence of God according to the narrative. So it's like, actually, it's harder on the parents, because the parents now have to live the remainder of this reality without their child around. And so that's utter suffering. You have to really be able to construct coherent meaning out of that. And that's very difficult to do, to say the very least. And I've thought about it a lot, especially while our daughter was going through cancer treatment. And, I've thought about it even here recently with as simple as our dog passing. You know, our dog we had since my wife and I were together a couple months. We got him, and he just died and just passed. He was 8 weeks old, and he just passed. And he was 16 and a half years old. And, you know, he's been around. We treat him like our son. And he went over to Europe with us both times and went to a bunch of the nationals and stuff whenever I was racing motocross. And so it's, you know, and you have to contend with that. But whenever you have God, it helps you try to make sense. It puts it in perspective through the expanded perception of the contextual elements at play of reality. Instead of just looking at the precise moment, you're looking at the context at play within this reality and the next. And so you try to make sense of that. So I'm at 30 minutes at this particular point, over 30 minutes. And so I do appreciate you guys for taking time to listen to this. I hope you enjoyed it. I plan on doing some more videos. It's been a long time since I've done one on Christian theology and apologetics. So I do enjoy it whenever I get a chance to do it. But right now I'm into graduate work with psychology to try to become a professor. I'm hoping to finish by the end of this year and then start teaching at community college. I got one of my research papers done up here recently. It's not published just yet, but it is preprint published on SSRN. You can check it out. It's towards evolutionary equality. And so I go in there to explain the evolution of sexual dimorphism and the reduction thereof, leading up into modern society, and how we developed greater coherence, evolving our consciousness as individuals and as a collective, especially here in the recent 50,000 years, and the contributions that we have made, and that it's not ideal by no stretch of imagination. Any developing system or developing individual, it's not perfect, but it has provided us, and they've done the best that they could as we've went through time, and we take it for granted oftentimes with the coherence that we currently have. And looking back, hindsight 2020, at certain events that have transpired and thinking how reprehensible those people are. And of course, we could say the same thing here in about 500 to 1,000 years from now, future generations will look back and look how stupid we are. And so a little bit of gratitude is due within my study. And so you can go on there and check it out. I actually put the link to the study in the video description. And I also have the website, my website blog in there, as well as my Medium website, and a donate button. So you can donate if you want to support my work. I'm really trying to get things kicked up this time, taking a little different approach, incorporating a lot of psychology at this moment, but as well as philosophy, religion. And so I'm going to see, where it takes me at this point. Thank you all. Hope you enjoy. Take care. God bless.